Welcome to the Game Week 13 preview, and this is Gian Batcher's 15-minute FPL podcast. I'm delighted to be back after the international break. We've got 8 game weeks coming up in just over a month, so it should be really hectic, and we've got a lot of decisions to make. So without further ado, let's get into the content. Okay, we're going to talk about Jarrod Bowen first, who honestly is probably the biggest topic of this week. Prior to the injury, which we'll come on to, this man was looking like the premier asset to buy. He had the most transfers in. He has a great run of fixtures. He's in great form and he's been accumulating loads of points at a very, very respectable price. So it was all looking fantastic. However, with the injury, it certainly makes things a lot harder for a lot of managers. Now, I'd say there are 3 ways this can go down. I did a little bit of research into what it is that his issue is, and people are saying it's fluid on the knee. Now, I'm not a doctor, but they say it can take anywhere between 1 to 3 days to a week to 4 weeks, right? So we could potentially see him back for Saturday. That is scenario 1. Scenario 2 is he's ready for Palace at home. And scenario 3 is he misses longer than that. And maybe back for Tottenham or after, depending on the extent of the injury. Now, we will have a press conference where we will certainly get a lot of data. But if Moyes is slightly vague, here's my take on how we should proceed. If there's even a small chance he's going to play Saturday, he's a definite hold, because then you'll get him for the Palace game, right? And even Burnley away is such a good fixture. Plus, transfers are so important in this tight, congested period where we're playing games every 3-4 days. It's huge. So I would keep him. If he's fit for the Palace game and he's going to miss this, again, I would keep him. Because there's no point in jumping ship to Mbeumo yet. He's got Arsenal this week. And if you really would like to do that move, you can always do it next week. But there's no need to do this move this week unless you really want to sacrifice him and for this week and get Eze or Kudus, and we'll come on to that. If he's out for longer, I think you sell. But I really think that holding him this week is the play and then reassessing if we get any more vital information. Right, now to look at Bowen's replacements and potentially people who could play alongside him, we're going to look first at Bryan Mbeumo, who is potentially, pound for pound, the best asset over the next 4 to 5 game weeks. The fixtures are fantastic. He has a blank in 18, but it shouldn't be too difficult to navigate. Plus, you get so much upside given you have a good fixture in 19 and a potential double in 20, right? So if you can get him in 14 without too much stress, I would. Now, would I sell Bowen for him? Probably not. I don't think that's the most efficient use of the transfer, especially if you bought Bowen earlier rather than later, given the value you've got stored up in him. He is heading off to the African Cup of Nations in Game Week 21, which we're going to come on to at the end. But there is something to think about just because you're going to have a few players going in and you really want to minimise how many. Eze has a good run from this week, obviously facing Luton away, and then the run continues, as does Morgan Gibbs-White, who has a really good fixture with Brighton at home. And the volume of injuries they have, I think Brighton could certainly be a team to target, and he's definitely due a goal. So these guys are all definite options, and I'd put Mbeumo at the top of the pack, right? There's a couple of others, but not Mitoma, because Mitoma now with the injury, I think he's most definitely a sell. The fixtures turn. He had his good patch of fixtures. He didn't perform, and I think if you've got him, it's just time to get rid. Mohamed Kudus with Antonio's injury is probably going to start every game now. Now, for those of you who haven't watched too much of him, this guy is a very, very, very good footballer, and he will undoubtedly achieve certain levels of output which are higher than a lot of players. And I think the eye test in his previous seasons at Ajax, and I think his ability that he's shown and what he's shown at West Ham are very indicative of him certainly returning points. So I wouldn't actually mind if you wanted to go sideways from Bowen to Kudus, or even if you wanted to go Mitoma to Kudus, with the aim of getting Mbeumo next week or just fading him entirely, thinking more of a long-term strategy. Right, moving on to captaincy. I've got Sterling here, and he's obviously not got the best fixture, and he's purely here as a punt if anyone wishes to go there. I think he could do pretty well. But I probably wouldn't go there myself. He's just for those who are really, really looking for a punt. But I think with captaincy, it's going to be pretty split anyway this week. There's 4 cornerstones which you could run to. I think that's more than enough, as opposed to just like a Haaland Salah debate and then you just fancy punting on someone else. So I would probably avoid him, but it's just for the slightly psychotic ones out there. Okay, so let's look at the 4 options: Salah, Son, Haaland, Watkins. Now we'll start with the Spurs Villa game. And I really like it for Ollie Watkins. I think, if anything, Spurs' line is even higher than Villa's. They're willing to take more risks. And I think the volume of injuries and suspension Spurs have probably make this a slightly tougher fixture for themselves than it is for Villa, even though it's away from home for Unai Emery's side. I think Watkins is going to get a high volume of chances in this game. There's so many avenues to him getting chances, whether that be the combinations with Diaby, the runs from Cash on the overlap, Digne occupying a wide position on the left, and he also occupies a lot of space there. And with the quality of delivery, that's another thing. You've got the central runners with John McGinn, so there's a lot of avenues to him get chances, and he doesn't really need to drift into the wider areas much more. It's much more focused about him being there, being in the box, and being on the end of chances, as opposed to kind of helping his teammates in other ways that he has previously. So I really wouldn't be surprised if he walks away with a haul. The only thing that I don't like about him is he's not too clinical, and he doesn't have penalties, and that doesn't fill me with the most hope as a captain now, because you need things to go really, really right for him to haul, because like I said, his finishing isn't prolific, certainly compared to the likes of Son. So he would have to have a very, very, very good game, and a clinical one, which is sort of unlike him, in order for him to justify you giving him the armband. So I certainly think it's a risk, but I do think he has the best fixture of the lot. Now, moving on to the other 9 in the game, Son. Whilst I think Spurs probably aren't the better side out of the two at the moment when you account for all the injuries, given Villa are going to have a high line, and I'm sure Emery will smell blood and try to go for it, with his clinicality and penalties, I'm sure he has penalties. I think there's a whole opportunity there. I'm not so much looking for Tottenham to have a particularly good game themselves. I'm just looking for isolated moments, which I think they could get quite a few of, when Son has the centre-backs in a precarious position, and I think he can capitalise on them better than anyone, given his fantastic finishing. So for me, I'm looking at that game as one where there's enough. I've got enough probability whereby I can be like, okay, you know what? There's enough chances that are going to happen here in this Spurs game. Even if Spurs don't have the majority of them, I know they'll have a decent volume. I know Emery will give it up. And as such, I can pick Son purely for his clinicality. And that's what I'm going for. I'm going for the fact that he's got a good fixture. But even though Spurs are slightly weaker now, or significantly weaker, he's good enough to offset that. So I wouldn't be surprised if they lose the game. I think this is actually going to end like a 2-2 draw, but I think he could be most certainly involved, and I'm giving myself a really good chance of getting a high ceiling return. Now, with the other two who are playing each other, I really don't like the Salah pick. I think one thing with Liverpool is they've got a lot of South American players, and given they all return late and they have the early kickoff, it doesn't really bode well for them. We've kind of seen it every international break, like Nunes get benched. McAllister hasn't, but he hasn't looked great off the international break. So I think that's just something to keep in mind. I think they have the hardest fixture you can have, City away. I think Pep Guardiola will be fuming after what happened at Stamford Bridge. I don't think he's going to give up anywhere near as much control, and I think they will certainly play slightly more cautiously, knowing what Liverpool can do to them on transition. So I expect Salah to have, honestly, a pretty quiet game. He is Salah. He can obviously turn it on any time, but purely in terms of the fixture and how I see that playing out, I can see City maybe even doubling on him. I think if you have Bernardo left 8 and Guardiola left back, it's harder for Salah to win. Well, it's easier for Guardiola to win as many duels, whether that be him or even Ake, as opposed to a traditional left back, whereas you have a centre back here. You also have Bernardo Silva with an excellent work rate at left 8 to help him cover. And I imagine the pivot will certainly be slightly more orientated to that side, where you can have the 8 to the right 8 to cover the other space, and maybe drop in to make a double pivot if need be. You also have the right centre back stepping up and then just congesting that left space to kind of protect Salah against Salah and his creative abilities. So for me, they'll try and keep him as wide as possible. I doubt he starts Elliott. I think he should, but I doubt he does. And if he doesn't, then Salah's probably going to be playing a slightly more supporting role to a very, very informed Darwin Núñez after a fantastic international break, and someone who could certainly capitalise on the threat of transition against City. So that's that. He could score, he could haul, but for me, just with all the evidence there, it's just not worth taking the risk. Haaland's probably, with Son and Watkins, it's very, 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 very tight. He doesn't have a very good record against Liverpool. He also hasn't had a particularly fantastic games against Virgil van Dijk, who's starting to seriously regain some form and looks like the best centre-back in the world again. And these type of things, I've seen them over time play into the outcomes. For example, Son has a fantastic record against Villa. And I don't like the fact that Haaland hasn't got a good record against Liverpool. I don't like that he hasn't done particularly well against Van Dijk. I don't like that it's the early kickoff. I can see this game being slightly cagey and low scoring as a result, and like both teams just very happy to walk away with 3 points, and they don't really need to put on too much of a performance. And if anything, that applies more to City going in as favourites. I wouldn't say heavy favourites, but certainly favourites. You can expect a very professional performance, get the job done, and go from there. So for me, I'm leaning towards Son just because I feel safer with him. But Haaland my number 2, and then Watkins would be my number 3. I just don't like the fact that it's the early kickoff combined, and off the back of international break, I must mention. I'm not trying to do it from the things that happen on Twitter and the superstitions, just that it's off the international break, and I think Liverpool will go there and try to make it very, very, very difficult for City and essentially kill them on transition. So they'll absorb a decent amount of pressure, and they've got a very, very informed Virgil van Dijk, who's at the peak of his powers again, or at least close to. Okay, so now we're moving on to the forwards. I really like this man as an option because he facilitates the others. He's cheap. He's really, really cheap at 6'4". And the 2 million you'll save over Watkins can be used elsewhere. I know people might be slightly reluctant to sell Watkins, and that's fair enough. But I think he does just provide you a fantastic option to take that 2 million and upgrade elsewhere in this festive period, which I'm going to come on to. You've got 8 games whereby there's going to be loads of injuries, suspensions, just resting and rotation. He won't, unless he gets injured, that doesn't apply to him. He doesn't really get booked, so you don't have to be too worried about the 5 yellow cards. He's got good fixtures over the entire run, especially in the Sheffield United away and Villa at home is great. In the next 2, he's got 90 minutes every game. He's got penalties and he's in good form. And Bournemouth have changed their system. At the start of the season, even towards fairly recently, it was completely different in terms of the defensive setup, and it really hurt their ability to kill teams on transition because they were conceding so much possession in between their last 2 lines because there was so much space there. They don't have this issue anymore. They've changed it. They've gone for a slightly more pragmatic approach, and I think over the course of the game this will result in Dominic Solanke having more chances essentially because it's not so rushed. It's slightly more patient. They look better, and I think in this type of period you've got to play the long game. You can go for punch, sure, but I just think it's less optimal to do so than in other stages of the season. And as such, I think I really, really, really like Solanke for this period. Just he'll tick along, he'll get you points, odd haul here and there, perfect. At 6.4, you can't ask for much else, and the money can be used really nicely elsewhere. Now, the reason I've got the Chelsea assets here is not because I'm telling you to buy them, but mainly what they represent in terms of planning. Now, we all know there's a fixture swing in game week 16 for them, and the swing makes it fantastic for them. They have a long run of very, very good fixtures that all appear as green in the FDR. And what this represents is you must be able to plan, right? You want to get to game week 16 having at least a double up, and by game week 17, maybe even a triple up, right? This kind of ties into everything. This festive period with 8 game weeks in just over a month is going to be very hectic. You want talisman. You want 90-minute players. You don't want to be making too many luxury transfers, and you want to be planning ahead. You want to make sure that the core of your team is very, very, very set, and you don't want to be messing around too much with it because this period can go really bad for you really quick if you make wrong decisions, right? If you're willing to take risks and you get it wrong, you will be punished. However, as long as you play fundamentally sound and just pick players who are going to have 90 minutes, who have good fixtures and don't take too many hits, you're going to gain a massive edge over the field. It won't be a small one because the volume of risks won't pay off in comparison to the other stages of the season, right? So I would say certainly plan, think about the Asia Cup, think about the African Cup of Nations, and because you don't want to have to wildcard too early in game week 21-ish. So just make sure your team isn't overly stacked with them, or at least you have exit routes, and make sure you've got a plan, for example, for getting Chelsea assets in game week 16. So that's all I have to say about that, but I would really keep that in mind. And I'm speaking from experience because I've made the mistake of messing up this period. It's traditionally the period I always mess up because I'm an aggressive manager, but this year I'm not going to do that. I'm going to make sure I don't make the same mistakes as last year, and I would encourage you to do the same. And that wraps it up. So if you could like and subscribe, we would greatly appreciate that. Make sure to follow Fantasy Football Hub and myself on Twitter. The tags are there, FFH_HQ and at FPL_GM Batra. If you could rate the podcast, that would be fantastic. And remember, there is 30% off and a 7-day free trial. So yeah, I wish you the best of luck for Game Week 13, and I will see you for Game Week 14. Thank you.